I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. So, unfortunately, we are without Flora again this week. She currently doesn't have much of a voice, but we wish her a swift recovery and expect her back for our next episode. A quick thank you to all our monthly supporters. As a nonprofit, your donations enable us to educate and empower people to make a difference on climate. And if you're listening to this and want to join our community supporters, head over to our website, climateoptimist.co, and click the donate button.
Even $5 a month makes a big difference. So if you enjoy what you get from us, take a few minutes to become a donor. But if you're strapped for cash, tell your friends about us and rate us on your favorite streaming platform.
Yeah, the reviews and the recommendations are important to reaching a wider audience. So take a moment and tell your friends and give us that positive review. So if someone asked you to name your favorite protein-rich foods, you'd likely respond with some combination of animal and plant proteins, like maybe chicken or fish or lentils or tofu, depending on what your tastes are. One item that you're not likely to hear, though, on most people's lists are insects. But it turns out that insects, like crickets, are actually a great source of protein as well as other nutrients. And unlike livestock that require large amounts of land and water and produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, insects have a very small environmental footprint. The question then becomes, what role might insects play in our food system going forward? But before we turn our topic of eating bugs, let's talk about this week's reason for hope.
Yeah, so the Chinese premier was recently in the US, and China has committed as part of this to include nitrous oxide and methane in its climate plan for the first time. They've also agreed to curb some specific methane emissions and work with the US to curb forest loss and cut down on plastic pollution. We still need China to align with original Paris targets, but this is a step in the right direction. And we'll include the article from Reuters in the show notes.
Yeah, it does seem like a positive development, albeit incremental. Maybe they read my newsletter you sent out where I was talking about China's need to step up their climate ambitions. Yeah, I'll be interested to see, I don't know about you, Thomas, but what happens at the upcoming climate conference and whether there's some additional more concrete actions that come out of that.
Yeah, look, I think any sign of cooperation between the big players like China and the US, rather than this sort of hostility that we've seen in the past where it's like, well, you're already a developed nation, I'm a developing nation, screw you, I'm going to keep polluting. Moving to this more mature position, I think is really positive because that will hopefully let us put some pressure on other nations to step up to the plate or risk these border adjustment tariffs, which hopefully will be the solution to a lot of these growing emissions in other parts of the world.
Yeah, completely agree. And the cooperative approach always yields more benefit. So our guest today, to help us dig into the world of insects as a food source, is Sarah Schlafly. Sarah is the founder of Mighty Cricket, a next-generation protein company with a mission to build a clean protein supply to sustain the world. After receiving an accounting degree from Truman State University, Sarah launched a career in food. She founded a nutrition and cooking school in North Carolina, was featured as Inc. magazine's military entrepreneur, and received an award from Wharton School of Business for her social enterprise. In her spare time, Sarah enjoys backpacking, rock climbing, skiing, and exploring the outdoors. Sarah, welcome to Climate Optimists.
Thanks for having me.
So to kick things off, when it comes to efforts to address climate change, what makes you hopeful?
Well, I see a lot of innovations happening in the space, everything from bug-based protein like we're doing to the lab-made meats. And I operate in the food space, so everything that I kind of watch is about food trends of where are we going and where do we need to be in terms of climate resiliency. And in the food industry, there's a lot of research and development dollars being spent on solving this problem of global food shortages due to climate change. So seeing all of this activity come about makes me really hopeful. And then also seeing Gen Z and our newest generation Alpha just really lean into solving and like putting their dollars behind products that are more being marketed as more sustainable. You know, they really have a passion for it. That makes me hopeful for change for the future.
Yeah, they do tend to prioritize that more than, me being like a Gen Xer. I obviously prioritize it, but it seems like Gen Z especially is very tuned into that sort of thing. Well, let's start out for those who may not be, tuned into it. What are sort of the challenges with kind of animal-based proteins in terms of our climate?
Yeah, the biggest challenge is that conventional livestock requires so many natural resources that are unsustainable. So, our current food system is designed to support about 4 billion people, and we're already at over 8 billion people on the planet. We have enough resources, according to certain studies, we can sustain 10 billion people on this planet. And our food system is just not designed to do that because our conventional livestock protein sources are so resource intensive, amongst other practices that are destructive for our environment. But livestock, it takes the biggest toll on our climate.
So, in essence, there's the issue of the emissions that, like, let's say, livestock create in producing, a hamburger, if you will, and then in addition to that, the consumption of water, the amount of land it takes, all those sort of things.
When you compare a pound of cricket protein to a pound of beef protein, you're looking at 1,200 times less water being used. You have 12 times less feed, and it's emitting 100 times fewer carbon greenhouse gases. So the environmental footprint of a cricket is a fraction of that of a cow.
In other words, crickets are much more efficient at producing protein as a nutrient than our, livestock.
Exactly. Yeah.
So obviously, Mighty Cricket, you guys produce cricket-based proteins. Where do insects kind of currently fit into our diet globally and maybe more generally?
25% of the global population consumes insects on a regular basis. So it's just a natural part of their diet. And this is a spread out across 80% of the world's countries. So we think of insects as very niche, but actually a very large portion of our global population consumes insects every day. For the rest of us, we're all consuming insects. We just don't realize it. So on average, we eat 385 bug bits every single day from our supermarket food. And that's because it's just impossible to grow and produce food, especially natural, very healthy food, without having insects be a part of that. I mean, insects are a vital piece of our ecosystem. And so they play a crucial role in diets, both in animals, humans, and of course, plants are very much reliant on insects.
So it sounds like we in the U.S. aren't accustomed, but it's, other cultures throughout the world, insects are much more commonplace.
Yeah, in Mexico, chapulines, so those are grasshoppers. That's really big. Ants are popular in Mexico. In China, the silkworm is very popular. And then in Thailand and Vietnam, crickets are popular.
Are there big variations? So knowing that there's different insects out there that folks are eating, are there big variations, or are they all pretty efficient when it comes to turning the food they eat into protein?
The insects are pretty efficient producing protein, but you do have variations in terms of your macronutrients. So, crickets are one of the leanest forms of protein that you can get, and the insect with one of the highest amounts of protein. Whereas mealworms, you're going to have less protein, but a higher percentage will be in healthy fats. When it comes to water bugs versus land terrestrial bugs, you're looking at water bugs being higher in EPA which is an unsaturated fat. It's a healthy unsaturated fat that is really easily digestible. So that's part of the omega-3 family.
Interesting. So almost like, we think of, let's say there are different sources focusing just like on protein. There are different sources of protein on a plant-based side. Some of them have more, more of certain nutrients than others. And the same is sort of true on the insect side. You have variations in terms of the other nutrients you're getting.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have pretty much all insects. Their exoskeleton is made of chitin. So chitin is a prebiotic fiber. You'll find it in crustacean shellfish. Some people are allergic to chitin. So if they have a crustacean shellfish allergen, they're often allergic to chitin. And therefore, insects is not a good option for people with this allergen. But for the rest of us, chitin serves as a prebiotic fiber. So it promotes healthy gut bacteria.
Interesting. So lots of different benefits. Well, what what are the factors that are kind of limiting kind of wider adoption of insects as a food source when we think of like, the Western world, if you will, Europe, the US?
Definitely in the US, we have this stigma around insects. And what's interesting is 200 years ago in New England, lobster was considered a water bug. No one wanted it. It was fed to prisoners and servants. And now lobster is it is the highest priced, very coveted meal across the entire US. So I find that the rise of fame of lobster really interesting because it's something that can be emulated by cricket and other bugs. So the three major stigmas that I have to overcome here in the US when marketing cricket protein to a American audience is that crickets are they're scary, they're dirty, and they're gross. And so in our marketing, we do everything we can to try and flip that on its head and present crickets as very cute, friendly, approachable. Our Mighty Cricket logo you see showing a very approachable cricket who's happy, he looks adorable. And then, people think of bugs as dirty and tainted. And really, what's fascinating about the bug industry, the bug protein industry, is that it's a really clean source of protein. And so I mean clean from an environmental standpoint, but from also just a health benefit standpoint. You don't have the flood of hormones and you don't have high levels of saturated fat. Also, you don't have steroids, pesticides, antibiotics going into the crickets. And then lastly, people just assume that bugs taste gross. And that is such a false assumption that I even had, just when I tried my first cricket product, I was like, oh, it's actually not that bad. But we all have this inherent assumption that bugs taste gross. And a cricket, the whole flavor profile depends on what you feed it. So I've tasted crickets that tasted exactly like pistachios. So wild. And then I've
Wow.
tasted crickets that weren't so good tasting. They were kind of had this sharp, very pungent taste to it. And it just depends on the feed. So you can really dial in on an optimal flavor profile.
Interesting. So almost like, a bee's honey depends on the different plants that it's out pollinating. The same is true with the cricket in terms of the things it eats drives the flavor profile.
Yeah, that's a really great analogy.
So what else, do we need to know for those who are new to this? What else do folks need to know about insects as a protein source or a food source?
The industry is in its infancy, especially in the US, but around the world, historically, those who have been consuming insects have been more rural. And there haven't been a whole lot of consumer packaged goods developed and a lot of marketing around it. So it's really the ones who are adopting this become the leaders for the world in building up this bug protein movement. And there's been an interesting backlash online from a very small group of people who developed this conspiracy theory that the elitists of the US are trying to get the rest of us to eat bugs while they enjoy their steaks, which I would say is definitely not true because all of my friends who are leading the charge in the US, I know all of the players in the space because it's very small and we're very collaborative. And none of them are backed by the big players in the US. So we're all just bootstrapping and just very passionate about the environment and saving the planet. So it's not this overarching conspiracy that has been portrayed on some social media platforms.
Yeah, I have seen a little of that, and glad you addressed it. One other question that I'm thinking about as we're talking about insects is, for those who are maybe eating more plant-based, already, obviously you have lots of good protein sources out there with plants, but I'm guessing the insect protein profile might be slightly different. Are there, how would we think about sort of eating, plant-based protein and insect-based protein? How do those kind of fit together? Are they complementary? Can you be substituting one for the other?
I find it very complimentary, and I'm not against a vegan diet at all. You get key nutrients from insect-based proteins that are really hard to find in plant-based proteins. So and that's across all animal proteins. They just have more bioavailable nutrients. So, for example, omega 3s in bioavailable form, which are EPA and DHA, aren't found in plant proteins. So, the omega 3s you get from avocados are in ALA form, and you have to eat 9 times more avocado omega 3s to get the same level of omega 3s from, say, cricket protein. So that's kind of getting in the weeds of nutrition, but there are, vitamin B12 is very hard to find in plants. And vitamin B12 is actually really, really high in cricket protein. It's probably the best nutrient that cricket has to offer, in my opinion, because most Americans are vitamin B12 deficient, which causes a whole host of health problems. So it's really nice to incorporate some of these proteins just to give your body the wide range of nutrients it needs and make sure that you're covering all your grounds in terms of nutrition.
So I'm taking away insects for somebody who is maybe, wanting for the environment or other reasons to eat more plant-based. Insects can be a nice complement in terms of the nutrient profile they offer. And really, then you're not, it's not hard to sort of get these things like B12, you said, or fatty acids that most people would say, hey, well, this is why you have to eat an animal-based diet. You can get that with insects. We're talking about insects in the context of, food for people, but I'm hearing that there's a growing industry as well focused on insects for animal feed, as well as for pet feed.
Yeah, I think that pet food perhaps might be a little bit lower of a hurdle in terms of gaining adoption. And chickens, of course, I mean, they love their grubs, their mealworms. So if you raise chickens, you're wanting them to eat bugs too. And then when it comes to animal feed, black soldier fly larvae is growing in popularity. And Tyson just invested in a black soldier fly larvae operation where they're feeding their cow intestines to the black soldier fly larvae and then getting that protein and feeding it back to their livestock. So insects play a really crucial role in building a circular economy.
Interesting. So the Tyson Foods that we all think of, big meat producer, is just pulled the trigger and is now in the insect protein world.
Yeah, it's really exciting to see these bigger players finally dip their toe or jump full into playing in the insect game because we've all overlooked, I've definitely overlooked the power of these small but mighty bugs. And that's what Mighty Cricket is all about, is elevating the small, lowly cricket into something that truly is mighty.
So one other question, as we're continue to talk about crickets as a protein source, among other bugs, um, what do crickets eat? If people are buying the, cricket protein, what's the, food source that's feeding those crickets in the beginning?
Well, out in the wild, crickets are omnivores. So they'll eat dead things, they'll eat plants, they'll eat themselves. They'll pretty much eat whatever's in their path. But on the farm, we have a very controlled feed, and we have it controlled for flavor optimization, as I was telling you before. But also, certain things you feed it can express different levels, varying levels of that vitamin B12 that we talked about, or those omega 3s. For the best flavor, we do a very mildly flavored diet, and then that translates into the end product. So we're talking grains, a lot of grains, some grasses. Grasses are really healthy for the cricket. A lot of farms will do cassava, potatoes, maybe some alfalfa trimmings. Um,
Interesting.
those are all very common feeds for the cricket.
So being, big one being driving that flavor at the end of the day is pretty important. So controlling the diet up
Yes,
front.
that's paramount for a human consumption. Now, when you're talking about pet food, animal feed, then the flavor isn't so important. And one of the things that we're trying at Mighty Cricket, we actually have a pilot farm going, and we're pulling waste from the St. Louis food region. So 40% of the US food supply ends up in landfills, which is huge. And the amount of carbon greenhouse gas emissions from food that ends up in landfills is more than the whole airline industry emissions. So this is a huge piece that can get upcycled back into the food system. We just need to figure out a good logistical way of doing that. So what we're doing is pulling all of the waste. Well, not all the waste. There's huge amounts of waste in our food system, but we're pulling waste from various food manufacturers, restaurants, grocery stores, and feeding it to the crickets and running trials to see what waste makes them grow well and what waste makes them taste great. And then from there, we're developing a proprietary feed based on that waste that we can then use to farm more crickets.
That's awesome. So insects really are a, kind of like walking biodigester, um, able to turn waste into food. Well, for those who are, listening to this and excited about the prospect of insect protein, whether for the health reasons, the environmental reasons, what can all of us do to help ramp up the insect protein space, right? So there's, obviously helping folks like you make this more mainstream.
The first step is to give it a try. And when I started my company 5 years ago, I was very nervous to try cricket protein. It was not something that I really wanted to have, but the facts were so compelling that it helped me overcome my fears. And the easiest way to try it is in a product like Mighty Cricket, where you're not eating the whole bug. It's ground into a really fine powder. And so it doesn't look any different from any other food that you're eating. And we make sure that our products taste amazing. Flavor is our number one most important factor. And then it's nutrition is number two for us. And we use 50% less sugar in our oatmeals. We have 0 gram sugar in our protein powders, but we make sure, first and foremost, that the product tastes normal and it tastes good. And then it's also approachable because you're not seeing a whole bug. And that's key. So step one is just giving it a try. And then once you try it, if you like it, share it with a friend. And that just helps with that whole word of mouth and growing awareness. And if you have a shellfish allergen, I don't recommend trying any bug foods, but you can definitely share the concept with friends and family.
Great. Well, and to that end, do you have any recommendations on places folks can go if they want to learn more about, whether it's the nutritional benefits or environmental benefits of insects?
We definitely have a lot of information on our website. So it's mightycricket.com. We have a blog with lots of information about nutrition, recipes, the sustainability benefits, all of that. That's a great resource for people to go to.
Great. We'll link it on our website. Well, Sarah, thanks for coming on and talking to us about a exciting and an interesting topic folks may not hear about on a regular basis, but it sounds like it's becoming more and more mainstream, and obviously excited for the work you're doing and, not just the climate, but also the health benefits that come with it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jason, for having me on and for giving the bug protein space a platform to get our message out.
Happy to. So, Thomas, what did you think of the interview with Sarah?
Well, look, I'll be frank, I don't have that much experience with eating insects. There might have been one or two that have I've inadvertently eaten when mountain biking, but I do see potential for it. I think it's one of those situations where today we export a lot of product from rural regions to cities, and I definitely see the potential in using food waste in these cities to have let's say, a second go at creating food out of that nutrition or out of those nutrients before they're again exported from those regions. Preferably exported back to those rural regions to grow product again and not dumped in the ocean as often happens today. So, in that situation, I think they've absolutely got a future. Where I'm a little bit more reluctant to see them as mainstream is where we'd end up having to grow product to feed the insects to then ship those to cities to feed people. How about you, Jason?
Yeah, it seems like the where you locate your facility, your insect farm is really essential, and as well as obviously what you feed it. I mean, I know Sarah talked about it impacting taste as well. So, it's clear that there's large parts of the world that already eat insects, and if the Western world has an opportunity to use them as a supplemental protein source. I think Sarah sold me enough. I'm going to go out and probably buy a thing of Mighty Cricket protein and start integrating it into my smoothies. But I think the piece that's clearly already here is insects in animal feed, as a protein source. To your point, there's the potential to live off waste. Unfortunately, in the U.S., we waste a lot of our food, upwards of 40%. And you can see, follow really the money at this point. Insect startups have raised over $1 billion in VC since 2020, and as Sarah mentioned, you've got this recent announcement of Tyson, a huge player in the meat space that's diving into insects.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, of course, everything here boils back to climate, and when you look at insects from a feed conversion ratio, and probably more importantly, emissions per unit of protein produced, they're definitely above and beyond what can be achieved with traditional meat streams.
Yeah, I was reading, and as you could probably speak to this, there's a wide variation in sort of feed conversion ratios, but I was reading, crickets in particular are roughly twice as efficient as chickens, and chickens are pretty efficient at converting feed into protein. They're about 4 times more efficient than pigs, and about 12 times more efficient than beef. And I mean, I think both from a climate and biodiversity perspective, that really translates to a ton of impact, right? Animals represent a big chunk of our farmland globally, upwards of 80%. And of the emissions from food, roughly 2/3 of it comes from, producing animal protein. And I think the important piece to keep in mind here is while it's taking 80% of the land and creating 2/3 of the emissions, it only provides about 18% of our calories. So it really that efficiency piece really is important.
Yeah, I think that we also need to keep in mind the nutrient value of these foods, and so it's not just a matter of units of energy or protein values, but it's like, well, what is the overall nutrition of these foods so that we can ensure that the public don't end up with like nutrient deficiencies and subsequent health problems. So that's where making sure that the insects and I guess livestock in general have good balanced diet, so they are making quality feed.
Yeah, I mean, we always hear you are what you eat, but I can't believe it's extremely different when we're talking about the insect world or animal protein.
And back to the feed conversion ratios and efficiency of insect farming, I think that it's important to keep in mind that insects by themselves are not going to save us from this climate crisis and biodiversity loss in general. This needs to go hand in hand with other mechanisms such as forest conservation acts, so that we stop the logging of forests and the creation of farmland to produce more beef, right? Because those markets for beef will continue to grow unless we go and put these measures in place that do restrict the logging and make beef growing in those regions less desirable.
Yeah, we need policies that protect both forests and incentivize less resource intensive foods. And as our vegan listeners know, the most climate friendly protein sources of all are plants. They require far less water, land, and generate, a fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions of livestock.
Yeah, so I think this is why it is so important that we just get a price on carbon, because once we have a price on carbon, the market will sort itself out. It will work out that, the insects are a better thing to eat than beef, or fish is better to eat than chicken. Who knows, right? But until we do that, until there's a true price put on the growing of these products, we'll never really know.
So completely agree with you. We definitely in the U.S. need a carbon price as well as, in other countries around the world. I think this all kind of leads into the question we always ask, which is, what can we do? And this week, we got a couple options. First, I want to encourage everybody to press Biden for real action at this upcoming climate conference in Dubai. Take 2 minutes, no more than that. Send him a quick email and tell him that we need the U.S. to align its climate targets with Paris. We're not too far off, but we still have room to go. And to pressure other nations to do the same. We got to lead by example on this. And if you're going to do one thing between now and the end of the year, this should be it. We'll have links on our website and potential talking points for those who want it. Second option is, as Sarah indicated, try out some cricket protein and tell your friends about it. It's high in iron, B12, omega-3 fatty acids. So definitely a clean source of protein. And if you're not quite feeling that adventurous, plants are the most efficient when it comes to producing protein. So, consider meat-free Mondays.
And if you want to get a few insects in your diet, but are not sure which ones are going to be the tastiest, you can potentially get some chickens. My chickens absolutely love snacking on insects, and they'll work out which ones are the tastiest and they'll turn them into an egg or two for you. So another good way of putting land area around your house to use, have a few chickens pecking away in your garden, keeping the slug numbers down.
Thanks, Thomas. Well, that's a wrap for this week's episode. Thanks, as always, to everybody for tuning in. If you haven't already, make sure you head over to our website and sign up for our monthly newsletter. Lots of good, facts on climate solutions and ways to get involved. Our next episode will be coming out on December the 12th. In the meantime, go out there and take some action on climate. Climate Optimist is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co and follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.